Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Scott Brooks. I'm a partner and vice president with Org Vitality. I'll be introducing the webinar today. It is my pleasure to introduce Victoria Hendrickson and the webinar Embedding DEI&B into Employee Listening Programs. I'm delighted to do this. I think it's a great season to step back and reflect on diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging. And I think you will get a lot out of this. Victoria brings a nice, fresh perspective on measurement and change and what it all means when you're trying to really change the climate in these important ways. Just some quick housekeeping items first. Number one, don't worry too hard about keeping notes. There will be handouts distributed following the session today. Secondly, save time at the end for Q&A. Save them up, send them in through the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll be taking some questions at the end of the session. And then finally, at the end, after you close out, expect to see a little survey on how things went and what you liked about it and what you might like to see from Org Vitality in the future. So with that, let me describe a little bit about the presenter, Victoria Hendrickson. I've known her, worked with her at Org Vitality for nearly 10 years now, and she's a clear thinker, a precise researcher, and she's focused on questions that matter, not just those that are important, but questions that you can do something about, something that's usable. So with that, I am delighted to introduce Victoria and the webinar. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Scott. Really appreciate the intro. And thanks everyone for being here. I know calendars are busy these days, so I appreciate your time and look forward to this discussion with you. With that, we'll go ahead and jump on in. I think we've got lots to cover today, but as Scott said, I do look forward to any questions or reactions at the end. So diving on in here, let's see. Here we go. I want to start with a bit of a check-in. You know, as Scott said, it's a good time to kind of step back and check in where we are with the DEI&B. It's certainly been a really critical topic in employee listening programs for a long time. I think it's evolved a lot, even just over the last couple of years, because our social landscape is changing really quickly. We've got a lot happening. One quick caveat, when I say the social landscape around us, I do want to take a moment to preface and say that today I'm going to be talking about how some of our broader cultural events have had an impact on employee listening. And a lot of the ways that's happened recently is pretty specific to the US and some of the events we've seen. So, I'd say the lessons I'll be talking about could certainly be extrapolated and applied to a more global context, but the specifics of today and a lot of the examples are definitely going to be US centric. So we'll just have that hat on as we're looking at that today. So, we have had a lot of these discussions over the last couple of years. Our goal today is to add something new to that. These discussions have been of interest. We've seen a lot of folks attend these. We've also seen a quick progression in what the content looks like year to year. So I want to start by kind of stepping back and seeing what that progression's looked like so that we can kind of look at where we are today. So pre-2020, as long ago as that seems, not so long after all, but in terms of, DEI&B, at that point, I think most of us called it D&I at that point. Most organizations had some kind of D&I program outside of their very basic onboarding training. In terms of measurement, most organizations had a couple of traditional items on a broader survey. So a lot of items that directly reference diversity. Does the company value and promote diversity? Some things on inclusive culture, whether everyone has a chance to succeed, things like that. Most organizations called it pretty good there and felt they were doing a good job. When we saw organizations offer credibility for those programs, a lot of it was based on outcomes, things like diversity promotes innovation or things like that, rather than specific values. And it's just the kind of place we want to be. In 2020 itself, we saw a lot of organizations feel a call to action. With that call to action, there was a lot more investment in DE&I. Well, with that, we saw the E, come into the DE&I as we focus more on equity. And we saw a lot of organizations explore not just what it means to be inclusive, but what it means to be anti-racist or some broader social justice implications. I'd say around this time is when we saw a lot more C-level DEI&B roles, as well as other leaders in the C-suite really taking a stance on social justice issues. At this point, we heard less of the business case for diversity and more of a value-centric statement for inclusion. It's the right thing to do. It's the right kind of values we want to stand for. It's who we want to be as a company to be from. In 2021, we saw a lot of organizations with robust listening systems start to evaluate what they had invested in 2020. They're starting to make these initiatives a regular expected component of the company culture rather than a one-time event. And so at that point, we saw a lot more DE&I specific surveys as it became a more strategic priority and something we wanted to measure. And so that takes us to 2022. We're about halfway through. So it's a good time to step back and say, where are we? Are we continuing to embed this throughout our culture and really measure for progress as we continue on this course? As a part of understanding how we measure that progress and use those measurements to drive change forward, I first want to double click on this timeline and see how some of these events have shifted perspectives and expectations to really see, where have we been to know where we're headed. And that takes us to this timeline here. All right, I know there's a lot on the slide here. So, as we're zooming into the last couple of years, let me start what's on the page, and then I'll kind of step back and we'll walk through the story of the timeline. So for each of these years here, starting at 2017, I've noted some major social events. Unfortunately, the ones that are listed here are negative. They brought a great deal of trauma to a lot of underrepresented groups. I do want to say positive events can certainly have the same kind of effect. Unfortunately, we have negative events in our last couple of years here. So those are the things like, Me Too, and certainly some of the others here. There's also major trends where relevant, kind of in the DE&I space. Some I described a bit on the last slide, but you'll see things like, unconscious bias became a popular training topic in 2018. Some of those things that moved along the timeline here. And then for each year, you'll see a DE&I average. That's based on our set of norms across a set of DE&I survey questions that are constant across these years. In the thought bubbles, you'll also see the terminology itself changes. I'm sure you all have found that as this work evolves over the years, so does the definition. I'll also take this time to say throughout today's session, I might bounce between terminology a bit. What I'm trying to do is use the terminology that's in place when we actually conducted whichever measure we're talking about. So today we very much call it DEI&B, but if we're talking about a couple years earlier, it might be something else. All right, so if that's mechanically what's on the page, let's kind of look at the story and follow the timeline a bit here. So at the end of 2017, we saw the beginning of the Me Too movement, in which so many women spoke up about the violence and injustice they faced in and out of the workplace. And then in the following year, what we saw was an increased focus on being able to speak up, be heard, report issues without reprisal, as well as an investment in unconscious bias training. And that work, continued into 2019, and much of it still continues. Over those 3 years, if you take a look at that DE&I index, you'll see the score initially dropped a tiny bit, following Me Too, but then it more than recovered the following years after the increased focus on the support that came following that movement. Then we get into 2020. In 2020, we saw the horrific murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, certainly among others. We saw the Black Lives Matter movement become very prevalent, and more than ever, we saw leaders of organizations, really taking a stand and specifically taking a stand on social justice. With that, they started investing in DE&I at much more significant levels and being a little more head-on about the issues. So, while a few years ago we, kind of talked about things like unconscious bias, in 2020, 2021, we kind of addressed the need for anti-racism head-on. 2021 didn't see the same level of outrage, but we saw many rights continue to be taken from folks in our trans communities in many states, as well as some other things. If we step back and look at the scores, you'll see between 2020 and 2021, we saw a similar pattern in our surveys. So we're seeing that DE&I score dip. A lot of our clients were really shocked. They're seeing a decline in their scores after an enormous investment in DE&I, and really they're saying, what happened here? We invested, we're doing what we think is right. Why are our scores lower than they even were before? Okay, so same data on this page. Here we're zooming in on that change a bit. What we're zooming in on is that DE&I index and how it's changing between 2020 and 2021. We've got about a 3-point dip there. A lot of our clients invested deeply in DE&I in 2020, and then they're seeing this lower score the very next year when, frankly, they expected to see an increase and, people being really supportive of the investment. So it was the exact opposite of what they're hoping to see. You see a smaller, but kind of similar effect in 2018. Following the attention from Me Too, we saw a little bit of a score dip. So similar pattern, much bigger effect in 21. So the big question here was, how does DEI or DEI&B get worse after we focus on it more? So here's where we like to pause. Measuring progress is really critical as we continue on this important path, but we want to be really clear about what we're measuring and how we categorize change. Normally, when we look at surveys, it's pretty straightforward. We think about an increase in score as an improvement and a decrease as a step backwards. At risk of overcomplicating something as similar or as kind of simple as a change score, I want to step back and move to a model of types of change. And then we'll look at what that means for how our DEI&B scores are moving around a little bit. All right, so here we've got a model with some types of change. When we see a score go up or down, something's changed. I want to be clear about that. Change is change. What I want to double click on a little bit more here is whether we're seeing actual behavioral change, or are we seeing a shift in how respondents calibrate to a scale? What is good or bad, or more broadly, how are they thinking about the construct we're asking about differently? What we're going to do here is look at a model that has alpha, beta, and gamma change, and then we're going to sort through how these apply to our DEI&B measurements. I want to say this isn't a new model or typology. The original citation is on the bottom of the slide. The full citation will be on the slides we send out afterwards. So certainly if you want to look through the literature of all of this, it's really interesting. There's a lot on this in terms of behavior and attitude change. But for today, I'm going to go through some of the definitions and how those apply to our survey score changes. For those kind of quick examples of alpha, beta, and gamma change, I'm going to start with our favorite small talk about this time of year, the weather. So what do these types of change mean? We're going to start with alpha change. This is the easiest one to think about, probably our default when we talk really about any kind of change. So the definition is that alpha change corresponds to absolute quantitative change, the thing increased or decreased. So as a tangible example, if it's 72 degrees this morning and it's 78 in the afternoon, as measured by a thermometer, it does feel warmer outside because it is, the temperature itself increased. Next up, we've got beta change. So beta change results from a respondent's subjective recalibration to the measurement scale. So this is, are we thinking about the scale and what it takes to be warm or cold differently? 78 degrees in New York feels a lot warmer than 78 degrees in Colorado. So probably because of the difference in humidity. If I'm going to fly from Boulder to New York and both happen to have a 78-degree day, I'm probably going to feel warmer when I get off the plane in New York because I'm calibrating to what feels warm, not because the temperature itself in degrees is different, but I'm changing my perspective here. And that takes us to gamma change. So gamma change results from not just a calibration of the scale, but the respondent's reconceptualization of the measured variable. So in this case, If I'm traveling between a couple different locations and I'm trying to figure out what feels comfortable outside, I might prefer to think of dew point. Dew point takes into consideration pressure and humidity, in addition to actual temperature. So I might use that to estimate how comfortable it's going to feel outside instead of just thinking about the temperature itself. So that's a total different conceptualization of the factors at play and what I'm thinking about. I'll say as much as we can kind of stretch this weather example here. So that's the different types of change and kind of a brief example, good and well for thinking about the weather this summer. But now I'm going to go back to the measurement of DEI&B and in particular, what's up with that drop, in scores post 2020. All right, so same data here on the left, where we're seeing that drop from 2020 to 21. But this time when we're looking at what happened, we're going to dig a little bit deeper than that company overall level. With that, I'll also preface, I'm saying company overall level. What I'm sharing here today is an aggregate view across several companies. It is a pattern we've seen consistent across multiple individual clients though. So we see we've got this drop at the company overall level. So we want to dig in and start to look at some subgroups. When we do this, we want to look not just at the scores themselves that year, what percent favorable are people feeling, but I want to look at how are these subgroups changing and are they changing differently? So, looking at the rate of change for each of these subgroups and in particular, are they changing in proportionate ways? So we looked at a bunch of different subgroups. It would take a long time to show you the full analysis plan, but I'm sharing one cut here in particular with race identity. So what we can see here is that the subgroups are moving consistently in the same direction. They're not the same, and they do vary by N size. You'll certainly see that the Black group dipped more than the white group. But the white group, which is, by and large, the largest N size here, it did drop. And it did drop, pretty significantly when you consider this N size here. So when we cut it further, we found that, not just the white group dropped, but the white men declined in a way that's consistent with our overall average change. So, why does that matter? In this instance, I'm thinking about white men as our control group. Why are they my control group? There have not been violent attacks or policy changes that discriminate against white men purely on that identity. So there may be instances of particular people in that group feeling less included, but on the whole, that's not what's driving this number down in a massive way. So, why are we seeing this consistent change and consistent, in our control group? It's probably likely beta change. So folks are thinking about the scale differently. Most specifically, they're thinking about what does it take to say, yes, this is an inclusive environment. This is an acceptable environment and it's safe for folks. It's harder to say yes to than a few years ago. A lot of people raised the bar for what it takes to say, yes, this is inclusive after the eye-opening events of 2020. A lot of people realized the environment isn't as safe as inclusive as they thought it was. Of course, our underrepresented groups have long held this bar. That's not different. It's just taken a lot longer for some majority groups to see that need for change and perhaps to see how close to home some of that is. So, this is one example, one cut, but, using that control group is one way we came to the conclusion that we're likely seeing a lot of beta change here. So, part of what to take away from this slide is if you've seen some recent dips in scores like this, try not to panic immediately. The social justice conversation has really come to the forefront and it's shaping the way people are thinking about what an inclusive workplace looks like. And that's a really good thing. That's really important in order to make any change. Of course, that's not going to happen overnight, but that's the first step that does have to happen to see more behavioral change. It does, however, mean it's going to take longer to see that behavioral change if folks are still in this kind of recalibration phase where they're kind of coming to terms with their starting point. So on our next slide here, we'll talk about evaluating this kind of change. And I want to start by saying I don't want the previous slide to imply that declines aren't important and that if everyone's declining, it doesn't matter and we should just wait it out. Kind of just the opposite. I want to characterize these changes so that you can create more informed and meaningful action plans. So, as you're looking at your own change scores, a couple of things to look at as you're evaluating what's really going on here. First thing is kind of proportions of decline and looking at those subgroups. So as you look at subgroups, are there some that have declined at a more substantial rate than the company overall? On some level, any subgroup that's declining at a greater rate is one to look into, but also think kind of philosophically, does it mean more if a particular subgroup is declining on that topic at a greater rate? If that's the case, it very well might be alpha change where something significant has happened in the local work environment. I want to say that can be true of an identity-based subgroup where you're defining membership by personal identity variables. It can also be true of a hierarchy-based subgroup, based on manager roll-ups. When we see a really substantial decline in a hierarchy-based subgroup where the respondents share an immediate work environment and a manager, but not necessarily personal characteristics, it's really likely to be alpha change or something in the environment. Something happened here. And with that, I will say, I'm talking a lot about declines based on some of these macro trends. Of course, the same patterns hold up with improvements. So if you see a big improvement in, kind of one specific subgroup, that is, likely the case that something went well and there was real change in the improvement there. Another thing to look at is the year of scores. Are we declining from high 90% favorables or the low 50s? Those mean really different things. A couple of points off of something in the high 90s is certainly worth watching, but it's also really hard to sustain scores in the high 90%. If something in the high 90s falls a bit, we can look to other parts of the survey to see, is this a pervasive general decline? We can look at the comments to see if they reference a change in the environment or a particular event. There might be something to it if that's the case. If not, it might be a wait and see. If the next cycle scores are stable or they improve, that's great. If we see a second year of slight decline, that's worth looking at and digging into deeper. Of course, if you see a lower score decline, that's worth a deeper focus right away. If something, 60% favorable or so, declines, it's a lot harder for those scores to decline. So we're likely seeing more change there. Another question to ask yourself, are those subgroups changing consistently? So, we looked at, are they all moving, but are they moving, kind of in the same direction? So, the declines we've been looking at, from 2020, the subgroups are all moving consistently in the same direction. Some proportions are bigger than others, depending on, underrepresented groups and local environment, but they're all moving in the same way and in a similar, kind of range of scores. If that weren't consistent, if perhaps one of the groups were moving in the opposite direction, that would suggest some alpha change somewhere. So using our earlier example, if the underrepresented groups declined significantly while our control group of, let's say, the white men improved, I would say something happened in the environment to be less supportive of those underrepresented groups. Of course, that's not what we saw, but look for consistency and are they all moving about the same ways? And then the last thing here is, kind of stepping back from the numbers. Is there a reason to see beta or gamma change? We saw this pattern immediately after Me Too and after George Floyd's murder, really huge social events that brought a lot of folks trauma. It doesn't have to be that large of an event to cause beta or gamma change, but you do need some, kind of some reason for folks to recalibrate or reconceptualize what they're doing on the survey. So think about if there is context that could cause something like that. It could be specific to your company. It could be specific to the market you're in. It could be, specific to communities where your workforce is. But think about, is there something that lines up? Okay, so we've talked about that there are different ways to characterize change, and we've discussed a couple of ways that we can evaluate those change scores to determine what's at play. And so from there, I kind of want to get into the so what. It's a nice model, but what do we do with that? How does that actually help you with your survey results and embedding DEI&B? Questions people often ask when we get to this model are, does it matter what kind of change occurred between each year? If change is change, do we really need to dive into this? We'll talk about when you do, when you don't, because change certainly is change. Another important question folks ask is, does a lack of alpha change or behavior change let leaders off the hook for action planning? We don't want to imply that leaders aren't responsible for continuing this kind of work based on what happens with the survey. So in this next section, what I want to do is go through some of the application for the interpretation analysis, as well as how you might use it for short and long-term action planning and framing up some of those discussions. So starting with interpretation and analysis, start with the recognition that some kind of change has happened. Your scores are moving in a meaningful way. We don't want to explain away the fact that change has happened. What we want to do is characterize, is it the climate in some kind of alpha change, a calibration to the scale for beta change, or is it conceptualization in terms of gamma change? So to evaluate this kind of change and what you're really looking at, and specifically with DEI&B content, you really want to start with different subgroups. Of course, we want these subgroups to be big enough to compare meaningfully, but we want to see, one, how do they score, but two, are they changing in a consistent way? Are they moving in the same direction with comparable proportions, or are there outliers? And I want to say those are two different questions. It's, one, are they moving in the same direction is kind of your first step. If you've got some improving and some declining, you're probably looking at some kind of behavioral change. If they're moving in the same direction, but one subgroup has perhaps declined double the amount of others, that's still quite an outlier. If they're relatively similar, we can still call that consistent. In addition to comparing them to each other, I would say, if possible, use some kind of a control group to establish an internal benchmark. In our example earlier, I used the example of white men when looking at reactions after racial violence, but that's not always going to be the right control group. So step back, think about your context, think about your workforce, and in particular, who's least personally targeted, by what's happening in the context in terms of your identity variables, and you use that to create your control group. And ideally, that control group is a large enough size to make any of these comparisons across different subgroups as well as year to year. When you're creating these kind of control groups, I'd also say, look at both hierarchy and identity. They might tell a different story. Often different parts of the hierarchy might have a different experience of the organization. Again, we want it to be a large enough group. Perhaps it's hierarchy at the business unit level, or not the individual manager level, but the experience could be quite different. So it's important to look at both of those and not just kind of slice by the more straightforward identity-based groups. I'd also say look at trend. Where you have comparable items, look across multiple cycles to see, is this a long-term consistent trend, or is it a new hotspot? And you want to match those cycles up to broader context and kind of what's happening out in the world. Social events that cause a recalibration show up really quickly. Me Too kind of happened overnight and led people to ask questions immediately. Same thing with the events of 2020. Those things happen very quickly. Of course, the aftermath unrolls, and kind of unfurls more slowly, but these do happen overnight, and depending on when your survey is, that can have a really big impact. So that's for recalibration. Whereas something like the climate and specific behaviors in your organization, I would say those happen more slowly, especially when we do think about things like DEI&B. Those behaviors don't change overnight. So if you are seeing kind of slow but consistent over time change, that might very well be behaviors. So overall, we're stepping back. If you suspect large scale beta or gamma change, is there something that supports it? Does it line up timeline wise? If you're not sure, I would say often looking at written comments are really useful in making this connection. So you can kind of give those a scan. Similarly, focus groups can be really helpful. I would say, with this topic, those focus groups should be done pretty close to the end of the survey, so that timeline wise, we're kind of thinking about the same events as perhaps when folks were taking the survey. but asking people what comes to mind with those items, that are changing might bring up new kinds of connections, especially if you have a really distributed workforce where, people are sitting in different places and experiencing a different context compared to where you personally sit. They might bring up a connection between an external event or kind of shift that may have seemed unrelated, but certainly had an impact. I'd also compare changes against other topics on the survey. So, kind of philosophically, it's similar to comparing those subgroups. Are we seeing similar proportions in the same direction, or are we seeing a steep standout? So if most items are declining a point or two and your DEI&B items are declining a point or two, it's a similar pattern. There might be something pervasive there related to the overall climate. If it's declining much more than your other items, or if it's improving while other items are declining, something more specific has happened. So we're really looking for, is this an overall pattern, or is it something that's standing out in kind of a hotspot way? So that's a lot about the analysis specifically. You'll notice I'm not talking about fancy statistics or a super complex analysis plan. I would say, with something like this, you can do a lot with comparing proportions. You really want to keep N size in mind, especially as you're lining up these different subgroups, especially as you're lining up different years. But I'd say it's more of a blend of art and science than digging deep into complex science. So the science here isn't so tricky in making the comparisons, but I would say there is some art of the judgment and how you're mapping scores to context and history itself to kind of zero in on what's happening. There we go. And that kind of takes us to action planning. So, typically when we move out of the analysis phase, it's to support how are we going to move into actioning and finding a couple of things to improve. If something has declined, the knee-jerk reaction is, well, we got to work on that and make sure the score is higher next year. I do want to underscore the point here that whatever type of change you conclude occurred, change did occur, so there should be a response. It's not that only if it's alpha or kind of behavior change there should be a response. No matter what, there's going to be a response. Sometimes the knee jerk is if it wasn't behavior change, we should wait. But I would say it's not that we should wait. It's that we need to shift our focus on how we act. Frankly, I would say that alpha or behavioral change is the easiest to react to because it's the most tangible. If you believe some kind of beta or gamma change is at play, I think the emphasis on short and long-term actions is really critical. If employees are just at the point of recalibrating or reconceptualizing what it takes to be inclusive, they're going to need a lot more support as they operationalize what this new perspective means, and they're going to need a lot more tools as they start to put these new behaviors into practice. So the expectation of just improving a behavior is a really difficult expectation if employees are just reframing what that even means. They're going to need a lot more support early, and they're going to need slower steps along the way to get to your target. So we don't just want to focus on, how do we get the score higher this next cycle? We want to think about what can we do, for that immediate support, but what do we do long-term? And that's, going to show up in that score, perhaps for years to come, not this next cycle. So we kind of want to broaden that lens to, success is what does this look like in 3, 4, 5 years to come? And that's not always how we think about survey responses here. So finally, framing up the discussion. This can often be the hardest part as we want to characterize what kind of change happened, but we certainly don't want to let people off the hook or in any way make them, kind of take their foot off the gas and working on this kind of content. So how do we use this model and how we talk about change? Typically improvements or declines are immediately categorized into what went wrong or what improved quickly, and that topic should immediately be celebrated or worked on depending on if that score is up or down. I think we can agree by now that at least on these DEI&B items, it's not quite that simple. I'll say in 2021, I saw a lot of DE&I teams be really disappointed. They worked really hard on some difficult content after 2020. They were expecting to see a lot of support through that, kind of in the survey, and they saw their scores go down. So it's a lot of investment in, the time, the money, and again, kind of difficult, sensitive topics that an immediate survey score might not support that. So, stepping back to say, it isn't that these problems cause things to move backwards, but they might have contributed to opening perspectives, which will lead to a much bigger improvement in, climate and employee experience in the long term, if they stay the course and kind of, hold on for a couple of more measurements. So, I think starting with framing the full context of the change and being intentional about those long-term plans. Often we think about our survey action planning in terms of survey cycles. How are we going to improve experience on this one item so that the score is higher on the next survey? That's how we see change, and that's how we know if we're doing the right thing. We do want to see improvement, and we want to see those scores go up. But when we look at something like this with that short term of a lens, we're really not going to be able to make true change. So as we keep going here, I do want to make a caveat. Often when we talk about these survey conversations, we're encouraging folks to drive those conversations and those scores down to managers at the most local level. For today's conversation, I am not suggesting you try to train every manager who gets a survey report on this type of change. One, it's too hard. It's going to be really complex, and it is not going to add value if it just confuses managers and they say, you know what, I don't even want to look at it. Two, I don't think it's worthwhile anyway. Managers tend to get hierarchy reports on their immediate team. They share work context more than an identity. So they're more likely to see alpha change in that report. That's going to fit the general advice of picking a couple of things and working on improving them. So not really talking about how you work with local level managers. I would say this is really for how you frame results when you're looking at a company set of data. When you're looking at your company overall and comparing your large, substantial subgroups, things like business units, tenure groups, job types, identity-based groups. It's a long list of groups, but the idea is it should be used by, someone with sophisticated, kind of analysis experience, and when you've got big groups to look at with stable definitions of membership. So those of you on the phone might use this when you're framing those results discussions with your executive team, understanding what are we doing at a company level, how are things moving, and perhaps thinking again more on that long-term view of are we continuing to invest in the right things? What kind of movement are we seeing in the short term so that you can continue to get to those long-term results? So what we're going to do here is pull it all together with a bit of a client case so we can see how this all comes together. So our client here had a really common pattern. The timeline here looks almost identical to our overall timeline in the very beginning. But prior to 2020, they had some pretty traditional DE&I programs, some training, some measurement. In 2020, they invested more deeply into anti-racism content specifically, and their CEO took a really strong stance about the importance of anti-racism, made a lot of statements to the organization about the importance to them personally, as well as to the company to be a good place to work. Throughout 2020, the CEO, as well as a couple of other leaders, continued to speak out about social justice, both in the anti-racism space as well as the differently able space. They continued to measure experience of the programs they put into place, as well as general DE&I climate, mostly on their engagement survey, not different surveys. So on some standing measurements they had. Similar to what we saw earlier, the scores in 2021 were lower than their previous years, and across the board, across each of their subgroups. So the immediate question was, are things getting worse? And kind of the follow-on to that, which kind of booted us into action, was should we stop these programs? If we're making this worse, and this is really important to us, do we stop it? Do we focus on something else? I'll say there was a little bit of fuel added to that fire when they dove into comments as part of their analysis. Couple clients saw this 2020 into 21. Not sure if some of you on the phone would have seen it in your organizations, but a set of comments that I would say, while kind of small in number, but they're really strongly worded, had to do with a lack of support for these efforts. The comments were really strongly worded about how social justice is political, has no place in the workplace, leaders shouldn't make political statements, et cetera. So, that paired with some of the declining scores led to, this question of, by addressing racism head on, are we fueling the fire, and are we further polarizing people? Should we stop and do something else? So, I want to start by saying, of course, anti-racism training didn't make racism worse. But, there is a point that it brought strong feelings to the surface, and not all employees were equipped to handle those. So it was a really tense environment. And, we've got kind of important, deeply held values at stake, as well as really significant investments in question. So we dove into an analysis there. We will describe that on our next slide here with how we walk through the process and frame things up for that team. So, first we start with an analysis, and I'll say we looked at every comparison there was. I've discussed this, in depth, so I'm not going to re-emphasize the points about looking at every subgroup, but I will promise you we looked at the subgroups every which way, as well as some other trends on the survey. We also matched up some of those trend scores against the comments to see, in groups where we're seeing that steeper decline, some were hierarchy, some are identity-based, what are people describing? Are they describing a specific event? Are they describing general environment? And what we found was pretty consistent. For the most part, people described general support for the focus on DE&I because it's critical to them, but there was a confusion or perhaps anxiety about what is that specific respondent supposed to do to help rather than exacerbate the problem. A lot of respondents were afraid to do the wrong thing, and specifically to be labeled a racist. So they're doing this anti-racism work, and they're afraid that if I don't get this exactly right, I'm the racist and I'm making this worse. So I'm just going to sit here quietly and do nothing and wait. So I would say that fear really paralyzed a lot of well-intentioned employees, and especially frontline managers. The frontline managers were responsible for a lot of the conversations, about the training content and kind of managing their team walking through all of this. So these frontline managers, many of which were hearing about anti-racism for the first time, are afraid that, if something comes up and they don't handle it right, it's their fault and they're going to make this situation worse. So that just added to some of the tension and kind of anxiety around the topic. So that's some of the analysis and interpretation. We also looked at timelines. So aside from the survey scores themselves, we looked at, when did employees take the survey compared to when did they participate in those trainings that were pretty intense? And when is that compared to when leaders were making those very public statements about how critical anti-racism is and how they've really got to do better? Of course, we also mapped that against external events. And one thing was really clear. There was a fair amount of time between external events and the survey, but there really wasn't much time between internal events. So employees took the survey really soon after this intense training, and really soon after leaders are making strong statements about the company needing to do better. So that adds up with our comment findings that people were reeling a little bit. So they're well-intentioned and, they, largely kind of want things to get better, but they're super overwhelmed in the short term of how does that happen and what's their role. So altogether, it looks like the perspective of folks has changed. So, the specific DE&I behaviors hadn't, we're not looking at suddenly a less inclusive environment, but we're looking at people saying, I know this needs to be better, so I'm going to score it, maybe not as high as I did last year, but I don't know what to do to get to that next step. So we're looking at beta change, or kind of more colloquially, a calibration of the scale. Well, what's acceptable? What does it take to score higher on some of these inclusion items? So that helped us frame some of those critical conversations. The big question of, did we make it worse? Overwhelmingly felt like no. Taking a strong stance on anti-racism doesn't create racism, but it does bring tension and anxiety forward, and that part can be polarizing. So, we did need to make some edits in the approach. So to both operational and DE&I leaders, the message was, definitely stay the course, but perhaps check in more along the way and offer some more support so people know how to get to the next step. So in order for them to continue with that approach and make sure people felt a little more comfortable, the idea was they needed to add more support to catch people along the way who perhaps weren't as ready for the shift. And again, to take those smaller steps to bring everyone along together. So this actually meant more investment into the DE&I strategy, which some folks felt a little uncomfortable with given the early program evaluation, but it was with a more focused path forward. So this meant more scheduled conversations on the topic of anti-racism, but the change was that managers weren't expected to handle it alone. They could request a peer or HR support person, so they didn't feel it was all on their shoulders. So instead of a kind of reactionary one-time event conversation with a lot of expectations, it felt like this is a regular team discussion that happens all the time. We've got support. It doesn't feel so arduous. The last piece I'll add here is, while we dug in and seemed to figure out what was at play in the results in this instance, we wanted to add to the next measurement to make this kind of inquiry a little bit easier on the next cycle. So since those of you on the phone have stuck with us this long, I'll tell you the exact item we added. We added, in the last year, my team has taken action to be more inclusive. It's not a super complex item, but the results can help you distinguish where there's been progress and energy, even if perspectives are continuing to change, and some of that kind of behavioral change is taking longer to show up on more general items. So, one micro takeaway from today might be to add a super behavioral item like that. In the last year, my team has taken action to be more inclusive. That kind of behavioral item is hard to see kind of a recalibration on. So I highly recommend it. To kind of close out this case, I would say, maybe next year I can report progress post 22 and more long-term shifts. That's really what we're going to be looking for, to see if that score starts to recover and stabilize. But right now, I would say the organization is continuing on their path of embedding the anti-racism training and starting to add similar things with other kinds of identities. So particularly with differently able awareness. The goal is to embed awareness of all kinds of identities so that employees can support one another rather than calling out one specific identity. So we're hearing that people feel a lot more supported, and that as this kind of training focuses on different kinds of identities, it feels a lot less tense and more open. So that's great progress, and progress that we were able to make by identifying what kinds of change had happened and where we needed to see a little more intervention. So to close out here, I want to look forward and think about what we expect to see next in terms of how DEI&B shows up in our listening programs, so that we can kind of look for each of these things as we look to our next set of results here. So again, looking at our different types of change, alpha change being the climate or behaviors, beta being a recalibration of the scale, and gamma being total reconceptualization. We've talked least about gamma change, so we'll go ahead and start there. Gamma change is really a total reconceptualization of what that construct is and what we're looking for. I think we're least likely to see that on our surveys if they're written well. Like if we have really focused items, I don't think we're likely to see folks reconceptualize what it needs to be respected or included. We might see a higher bar on what it takes to say, yes, this is inclusive, or I can bring myself to work. But the construct itself is really stable. So, if we're using really similar questions and terminology here, it's likely to be alpha or beta change. I do think where we're likely to see gamma change is how we conceptualize our goals. And we've seen some of this in just our terminology. So, even today, we've talked about diversity, diversity and inclusion, inclusion and diversity, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. That, alone just shows how much the space has expanded. And I think the more we expand the definition of the work, the more we're likely to see that gamma change in our goals. So, today we've talked a lot about adding anti-racism into the kind of work we do. I think the difference between being inclusive and anti-racist is really significant, although that nuance is new for a couple folks in our organizations. So as we weave in those more forward-thinking goals, I think we're likely to see gamma change just in the landscape of what we're doing, not necessarily on survey scores, but just in how we're weaving in those expectations. Specifically, the areas I see right for that are, continuing to name anti-racist work, as well as better recognizing and affirming gender identities that go beyond male and female, also in the differently able community, and recognizing those needs and accommodations. So as we see organizations recognize the need for these kinds of things, we're going to see more organizations continue to measure the employee commitment to things like anti-racism. We're going to see more organizations offer employees the opportunity to self-identify gender identities with a more inclusive range of options, and to identify ways that they're differently able and need different kinds of support. So I hope we see these and other efforts continue and really be the norm. But I think those are the things we might continue to kind of reconceptualize. In terms of alpha and beta change, I think some of this depends on the world around us. If we continue to see major world events that threaten social justice, or perhaps push us forward in social justice in a big way, we'll likely see some ongoing beta change as we constantly recalibrate, what our expectations are. If we see a more stable environment, then I think the changes we're likely to see in our listening systems are more likely to be alpha or kind of behavioral change. As we have a consistent expectation, we can kind of chip away at that. With that, I'll say I'll stop my trend predictions there, since we're kind of guessing at what might be in store in the back half of 22, and that is certainly beyond what I have for today. If any of you hold that crystal ball, I'd love to hear about it. But could be a lot in store for the rest of the year. So with that, I'll pause, and I'd be very interested in any questions or reactions.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Victoria. By the way, if people have questions, please submit them in the Q&A chat box or the chat itself, and I see some coming in. But I want to thank you. I think the three types of changes in this DEI&B context, I think, really helps to give us a new vocabulary for evaluating differences and gaps and changes. And certainly it also fits, the three types of changes fits how the pandemic has changed how we view topics like work-life balance or wellness or other things like that. So it certainly is not limited to using it for DEI&B, but it seems to fit really nicely. I'm going to start with sort of a fairly maybe tactical kind of question, and I think it's generally about N sizes. And the question is, what are the most significant survey measurement issues regarding DEI&B for LGBTQIA+? And more specifically, what sample sizes are significant, especially in smaller organizations of maybe a couple of thousand? How do you handle sample sizes?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And that's where averages and sizes don't help us. Often the groups we are most concerned about are very underrepresented and are a much smaller N size, and often not quite a fair fight to compare against the majority. So I definitely understand the complexity with the question. I mean, short of doing some significance testing itself, we tend to use a couple of kind of rule of thumb thresholds for N sizes. So, if we've got 100 or more folks in each comparison group, 5% points favorable or more is a meaningful difference. If you've got 50 to 99, we need to see 10 points difference for that to be meaningful. And if you've got fewer than 50 folks in either of those comparison groups, we need to see 15 points for it to be meaningful. So those are, kind of good thresholds to look at if you're kind of comparing existing results. If you're doing something more nuanced, perhaps testing the significance would be helpful. But I think that's a good place to start.
Good. I'm going to move to sort of a goal setting question, and I'm going to see if I can mush a few of what people have been asking together. You've got an organization, you've got leaders, they've set DEI target scores, right? And you've talked a little bit about change and how all these three types are real change, and don't let leaders off the hook, and you're responsible for acting on what you feel is important, right? So all that sort of groundwork. But how do you help people navigate change given these three things in mind, when I think, and here's sort of a weave in of a side thing, I think that sometimes people are looking at evaluating the environment generally, right? Is it improved or not, or changed or not? And also evaluating programs, right? Like your case study. Mm-hmm. And so maybe you could address how to help people navigate goals.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. We're data people. We always want people to, kind of evaluate what they're doing and set some tangible goals. I think often those goals have to be a little more long-term. I think we need to measure regularly and, kind of use each measurement to help us course correct, kind of as in the example of the case study. We use the data. We didn't want to make a decision of, do we stop the program immediately? But, if our long-term goal is to use this program for lasting change, how do we use the immediate data to make small course corrections to help us with our long-term target? I think there are some things that might change in a tangible way between survey cycles, but something as, kind of value-centric as DEI&B, it's not going to change broadly at a company level all in one survey cycle. So it's setting a long-term goal and then using the short-term check-ins to kind of course correct as we get there. And I think that's often different than how we talk about other survey topics. So that can take some kind of calibration with leaders. I think another goal that's good is action-based goals. So, kind of in again, the example of the case study, even if the score is moving around a bit, we can still, keep people accountable for, are they having those conversations as regularly scheduled as agreed upon? Are they, continuing to have those check-ins? Are they, doing the other things that they've agreed to? Those are very countable, trackable things that are also going to get us to our long-term goal. That are true, even if people are still kind of calibrating to the survey measurement itself.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit like that item you added based on the case study results about, I have seen action in my work. Mm-hmm. Another question up here was, could you have swapped in other topics for DEI&B like quality or safety, or there's sort of anyway, I'll just pause right there.
So can the model be used across other topics? Certainly. I would say, the more tangible the topic is, like safety, the less likely someone is to recalibrate, is this safe or not? Or, what does safety really mean? But you certainly can see it. And I would say often when that happens with more tangible or work-based topics, you might see, kind of recalibrations in different functions of an organization. So if it's the year of quality and we want to rethink, what it means to be high quality and deliver quality service, your quality group might drop before everyone else because they are rethinking quality and they know that the organization is not where they want to be.
Mhm.
So they're going to drop and then hopefully improve, but they're changing their standard. That can happen.
Right, for sure. Well, yeah, or pandemic has changed how we define safety on some level.
Totally.
With sort of a health safety, but you're right about the concrete part. And it does feel a little bit, some of it, what you talked about touched a little bit on almost that old teamwork model of forming, storming, norming, performing, where the storming is sort of the recalibration or maybe the beta.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're at time. Do you have a last statement you want to leave us all with?
I just want to thank the attendees for coming. If there's any questions I didn't get to, I'd be happy to have an email exchange. So I appreciate everyone's time.